So the author goes on to say, وَأَمَّا السُّنَنُ الصَّلَاةِ فَاثْنَا عَشَرًا. Yani the sunnah acts of the prayer are 12. And generally what we're referring to when we say the sunnah acts are those things in which the Sharia has recommended and has certified and stressed the reward of performing. The first one he mentions is a Suratul Ba'd al-Fatihati fi al-Ruku' al-Ula wa al-Thaniyati. Reading a surah after Fatiha. So we mentioned that reading the Fatiha in the first and second rak'ah or in every rak'ah is obligatory. But reading a surah after the Fatiha only in the first and second rak'ahs of any prayer, then it is sunnah. Although they mention the surah, which means to read another verse, what the Maliki actually mean is to read any significant anything that's significant after the Fatiha. So even if you were to read one complete ayah, that would be considered sufficient. So that is it is sunnah for a person to read after the Fatiha at least an ayah. But understand in the books of Maliki Fiqh, they always use the word surah, which a person would get the impression that a person has to read one complete surah, but what they mean is ba'da surah, yani a little bit, anything or something substantial after the Fatiha. And they mention in the commentaries that even if a person were to read an ayah, one verse of the Quran, that would be sufficient. As-suratu ba'd al-Fatihati fi al-rak'at al-ula wa al-thaniya, yani reading a surah after reciting al-Fatiha, but this is only in al-rak'at al-ula wa al-thaniya, and not in the third or the fourth rak'ah. So a person in the third and fourth rak'ah only reads Surah al-Fatiha. Then he mentions wal qiyamu laha, and it is also sunnah to stand for the recitation of of the surah that comes after Fatiha or the ayah, as we mentioned previously. So that's wal qiyamu laha. Was-sirru fima yusarru fihi, and it is also sunnah to read quietly in those prayers that are to be read quietly. For example, Dhuhr is to be read quietly, so reading it quietly is sunnah. Whereas in Isha, reading out loud in Isha in the first two rak'ahs is reading out loud in Isha is sunnah. So what he mentions here is وَسِرُّ فِيمَا يُسَرُّ فِيهِ وَالْجَهْرُ فِيمَا يُجْهَرُ فِيهِ, which we can translate as reading quietly in those rak'ahs that are to be read quietly, and to read out loud in those rak'ahs that are to be read out loud. Then he says وَكُلُّ تَكْبِيرَةٍ سُنَّةٌ إِلَّا تَكْبِيرَةُ الْإِحْرَامِ فَإِنَّهَا فَرْضٌ كَمَا تَقَدَّمَ. And then he says كُلُّ تَكْبِيرَةٍ is sunnah. Every takbir, meaning every time you say Allahu Akbar, are all the places in the prayer where you say Allahu Akbar, which is every time a person moves from one position to another position in the prayer, they say Allahu Akbar, is sunnatun, is a sunnah, illa takbiratul ihram, except for the takbir that is done at the beginning of prayer to enter the prayer, فَإِنَّهَا فَرْضٌ, because it's obligatory, كَمَا تَقَدَّمَ, as was mentioned before. And what he means by as was mentioned before, because you mentioned in the previously that one of the obligatory acts of prayer is making takbiratul ihram, making the takbir, saying Allahu Akbar to enter the prayer, and all of the other takbirs that are made after the prayer, after the takbiratul ihram, are all sunnah, and that's what he's referring to here. Then he goes on to mention the next sunnah act was Sami Allahu liman hamida, which means may Allah hear the one who praises him. And so during the prayer, Sami Allahu liman hamida, which is said for lil imami wal munfaridi, which is specific to the imam wal munfarid. What does that mean? Lil imam, when the imam is praying and he goes into ruku', he's going to, when he comes up from his ruku', he's going to say Sami Allahu liman hamida. Likewise, a person who's praying alone. The reason why he mentions the imam and the person praying alone is because the person who's praying behind the imam is not going to say Sami Allahu liman hamida, because it's the imam who's going to say Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then the person following the imam is going to say Rabbana lakal hamd. So that's why he limits it to lil imami wal munfarid. The imam and the one praying alone says Sami Allahu liman hamida. Then he moves on to mention wal julus al awwalu. Wal julus al awwalu, what he's referring to is the first sitting. And what we mean by the first sitting is the sitting that occurs in the second rak'ah. So in the Maliki Fiqh books, they're going to call it al-julus al-ula wa julus al-thani. When they say julus al-ula wa julus al-thani, julus al-ula, the first sitting, means the sitting that is done in the second rak'ah, wa julus al-thani means the sitting that is done in the second rak'ah. So the julus al-awwal is sunnah, as he mentions here. And then he moves on to say وَزَائِدُ عَلَى قَدْرِ السَّلَامِ مِنَ الْجُلُوسِ الثَّانِ. And then he says, whatever, it is also sunnah, the sitting of in the last rak'ah, other than the time it takes for a person to say Assalamu alaikum. And I explained this previously during our discussion on the concerning the obligatory acts. وَزَائِدُ عَلَى قَدْرِ السَّلَامِ مِنْ جُلُوسِ الثَّانِ means that everything in the last rak'ah, other than the time it takes to say Assalamu alaikum, is also a sunnah. But I mentioned to you the complete breakdown in it. As long as, in order to know the ruling of the sitting in the last rak'ah, we're going to look at what is done in it. So when a person is saying Assalamu alaikum is wajib. Thus the sitting during that period is wajib. When a person is saying the tashahhud is sunnah, and so the julus is sunnah. Reading salawat on the Prophet ﷺ is a fadila, or you can say mustahab. Then that sitting is al-fadila or al-mustahab. So that's the breakdown of what he's mentioning here. Then he says وَرَدُّ الْمُقْتَدِي عَلَى الْإِمَامِ عَلَى إِمَامِهِ السَّلَامَةِ. Repeating or returning the salam. Yani raddul muqtadi means the returning of the salam for the one who is following his imam. What does that mean? When the imam says Assalamu alaikum, then the ma'mum is going to say Assalamu alaikum to his right, which is the obligatory act, and the sunnah act which he's referring to here is saying Assalamu alaikum to the front. Then he says وَكَذَلِكَ رَدُّهُ عَلَى مَنْ عَلَى يَسَارِهِ إِنْ كَانَ عَلَى يَسَارِهِ أَحَدٌ. Then he says that it's also sunnah for a person to make a salam to the person on the left if there is a person beside him. In short, what I just mentioned to you here is what he's mentioning is that obviously the first salam for the one who is following the imam is obligatory. But what is sunnah, what he's talking about here, is after you say Assalamu alaikum to your right, it is sunnah to say Assalamu alaikum in front of you to the imam. And then if there is somebody on your left, then you're going to say Assalamu alaikum on your left. So a person who's praying in jama'ah, technically speaking, if there's somebody on his left, he's going to say Assalamu alaikum 3 times. Assalamu alaikum to the right, then Assalamu alaikum in front of him, which is for the imam, then Assalamu alaikum on the left. If there is somebody on his left, if there is nobody on his left, then he's not requested to do it. Then he says وَالسُّتْرَةُ لِلْإِمَامِ وَالْفَذِّ إِنْ خَشِيَ أَنْ يَمُرَّ أَحَدٌ بَيْنِ يَدَيْهَا. وَالسُّتْرَةُ means to put something that is, we can technically say at least a sutra is what a person puts in front of them if they fear, as he mentions here, in khashya an yamurra ahadun bayna yadayhima. If he fears, or if he thinks, what fear here means is if he thinks that somebody is going to cut in front of him. So if he thinks that somebody is going to cut in front of him during his prayer, like example, in a masjid, after the sunnah prayers, a person might be, after the obligatory prayer, a person might be performing his prayer in a place where he thinks that somebody might walk in front of him. Maybe he might be close to the door, or just in an area where people may walk past him. Then it is sunnah for him, for the imam or the individual, to place a sutra in front of him. And a sutra, as we mentioned, is something that a person puts in front of him if he fears that somebody is going to cut in front of him. And so there are a couple conditions that have to be met in order for a person to obtain the sunnah of the sutra. It should be something that is the length of an arrow. So we can generally say something that is generally an arm span long, right? It has to be at least an arm span long. It has to be something that can stand up and is sturdy, for example, a chair or a stick for a person who's praying outside by sticking it in the ground. It has to be pure. It cannot be made from impurities. It cannot be, it cannot consist of things that are impure. Also, it cannot be something that is distracting, something that would distract somebody in prayer. For example, something that has a lot of colors or designs, or something like a flag, if we consider these things distracting. And so in order for a person to get the sunnah of the sutra, then some of these conditions have to be fulfilled. Now, one has to understand that these conditions are conditions in order to obtain the sunnah. It doesn't mean if a person has something like, for example, a sister wants to pray and she has her handbag, so she's going to put her handbag in front of her so other sisters don't walk in front of her, then she should do so, because by doing so, she's going to prevent people from walking in front of her. What we're talking about now is the type of sutra that a person uses in order to get the reward of the sunnah. Also, another important factor that he mentions, he says that the sutra is sunnah for two types of people. One for the imam, and the other is for the person who's praying alone. Now, what is interesting is that he doesn't mention a sutra for anybody who's praying behind the imam. So one who is following the imam, he doesn't mention the rule, because the rule of the one praying behind the imam is that the imam is his sutra. The imam is the sutra of the one who is following him. What does that mean? Technically speaking, while you're praying behind the imam, if anybody were to walk between the rows to walk in front of you, they're technically not walking in front of you, because the sutra is the imam. So a lot of the mistakes that people make, for example, a person nullifies his wudu, and because he doesn't want to walk in front of people, he starts cutting through the lines, spitting between the lines, trying to walk all the way to the back of the mosque so he can get to the place to make wudu. But the proper sunnah of leaving the prayer when a person has a nosebleed or something is to walk straight down the aisle, because by walking straight down the aisle, he is actually not walking in front of anybody, because there's a sutra, and the sutra is the imam. So that's why he doesn't mention in this category of he doesn't mention in this issue of placing the sutra, he doesn't mention one who's following the imam, because the imam is the sutra. So when a person is praying behind the imam and somebody's exiting the prayer and they're walking down the aisle, nobody should put his hand out in front of him, because the sutra is the imam. And that is the end of the sunnah acts that the author al-Ashmāwī mentions in the text.